Today we are talking with Richard Schmalensee, the author of the multi-sided platform related book called Matchmakers, the New Economics of Multisided Platforms, and is co-authored with David S. Evands. And Richard is also the Howard W. Johnson Professor of Management and Economics, Emeritus, in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And you also served as the Dean of the MIT Sloan School of Management for 9 years and as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. You're also known as one of the world's leading scholars on the economics of industrial organization, and you've done pioneering research on the new economics of multi-sided platforms. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you very much.
Who are matchmakers and why they are important?
Matchmakers are typically businesses. They don't have to be businesses, but typically businesses that add value and make a living by connecting members of two different groups. It's an old model. It goes back to village matchmakers that connect eligible men and women. But in the modern era, this model has been, we say, turbocharged. It's certainly been made more powerful by technology. So we have entities like Uber, which couldn't have existed before high-speed mobile communications. They are having a huge impact on the economy and a huge and growing impact.
Early on in the book, you go on into comparing the single-sided platforms with the multi-sided platforms. So would you kind of summarize what are those differences and how they both are relevant and still exist today in our economy for sure?
Oh, sure. A single-sided business basically has really only one sort of customer. Even if it has multiple products, it has one sort of customer. If I'm an automobile manufacturer, I may sell different models to different demographics, and I have to attract those customers, but I go out and buy my supplies. I don't usually have a problem finding somebody to sell me steel and upholstery and tires and all the various things I need. I focus on one side of the market, on customers to buy cars. If I'm Uber, well, I have to attract drivers and I have to attract riders. If I can't get people to drive for me, I've got no business, no matter how many people want to ride. And if I can't attract riders, well, then I'm not going to have any drivers and I don't have any business. So I'm in this difficult situation of needing to figure out, people call it a chicken and egg problem. I have to get both riders and drivers, or I don't have a business. Whereas the car manufacturer just needs to find people who want to buy these cars. There's no matching. There's no need to solve a chicken and egg problem. You just need the chicken. You need somebody to buy the cars.
But early on, wasn't the Henry Ford who had to struggle to find and work with Firestone to make sure the tires were there, work with the steel companies to make sure the steel quality and quantity that he needed?
But it's a different, absolutely. It's a different situation, though. That's a standard business negotiation. I mean, Firestone is happy to sell him tires. He doesn't have to persuade Firestone to sell tires. What he has to persuade Firestone to do is to give him the price and quality he wants. That's a standard business circumstance. Firestone didn't really care, right? If Ford signs a contract to buy so and so many tires, Firestone doesn't care whether Ford sells cars. Firestone cares that Ford buys the tires and pays for them. So, yeah, in some sense, Ford has to sell the cars. But the contract is somewhat different. It is a contract to buy tires, and Firestone's in the business of selling tires. It's a different kind of attraction than the kind of attraction you need to get a buyer.
So it sounds like multi-sided platforms, as we call today, are far more difficult than a single-sided platform to start and, as you say, ignite and then operate.
They're more difficult, particularly if you're doing something new. We start the book with the example of an online restaurant reservation service called Open Table. It's highly successful in the U.S. and some other countries, but not universally. But they had to attract restaurants to take reservations over the internet, and they had to attract diners to make reservations over the internet. If they couldn't get reservations, then who would use the service? And if they couldn't get diners, why would a restaurant ever sign up? they addressed that problem by becoming single-sided for a while. They persuaded restaurants that you could use software to manage your tables, to keep track of reservations, and to keep track of who your loyal customers are. And then when that was installed, that's a single-sided business. Just, you get software that's useful to restaurants. And then when they had restaurants using their software, they could connect them and then go to other to diners, potential diners, and say, you can now make a reservation at these restaurants over the internet. That was a difficult thing to do, and they ran through a lot of money before they figured out how to do it. Before they figured out that you really shouldn't go nationwide, you should start in a city or two and demonstrate there that you can do it and focus, because if I'm sitting here in Vermont, as I am at the moment, I don't really care that there are a lot of restaurants in Kansas City that I can make reservations at. I care about what's here. So it's more difficult. The startup is difficult, and then you have to keep things balanced. You often have to have rules that affect the behavior of people who use your platform. That's not a single-sided business problem.
Yes, and I think you mentioned very well in the book is that multi-sided platforms have deep historical roots, except that the technology has just turbocharged everything.
Absolutely, and I think Uber, in some ways, is the best example, right? I mean, we talk about how my co-author, standing on a sidewalk in Brussels, could take out his phone and say he wanted a ride, and that signal would go to Uber's headquarters in San Francisco, and the request would go out to riders in Brussels, and within a few minutes, he'd have a ride to his destination. Well, that's just inconceivable until quite recently, and with a graphic interface on his phone showing him where the ride is on a map. So it's an extraordinary thing. Social networks are another interesting example that couldn't have existed until recently, and now are very powerful. But again, as you said, it's an old model, from village matchmakers to stock exchanges, to newspapers, to shopping malls. But now, boy, you can do very interesting and exciting things over the internet.
Yeah, and in the book, you actually have a very a good example, which is what I would call is a traditional economics example, or traditional economy example, and that is Aventura Mall, which is where I go all the time and is very close to where I live.
That's I was going to say a classic example. Shopping malls are not that old a concept, but they're a post-World War II concept, I think, mostly. And it's classic. They have to be attractive to shoppers in terms of parking and location and other amenities, and they have to be attractive to stores, to vendors, because of their ability to pull traffic through. And then they have to be designed to encourage foot traffic within the mall, so that you get shoppers walking by stores that they hadn't thought of visiting, and then they might visit on impulse. So the design, the layout of malls is interesting. The fundamental need to be attractive to both sides is present. And if you can argue that they really are competing and competed with traditional downtown locations, which served as a platform. Shoppers went downtown, stores located downtown, but by and large an unmanaged platform, and malls are a managed platform.
Tell us what if I'm a manager, or I'm an entrepreneur rather, and thinking of starting a supply-sided platform in any specific industry that I may think of: restaurants, dating site, video games, search engines, and there are many more out there. What do I need other than a good technological grasp?
Well, you clearly need that, but there's a tendency, not just in the platform business, but in all technology-based businesses, for entrepreneurs to fall in love with the technology. That is to say, if it's really neat and clever, we can make money on it, which of course is wrong. Lots of really clever things just aren't very interesting to buyers. In the case of a two-sided platform, I think there are really two primary things. Well, three primary things you have to worry about. First, is your idea solving an actual problem? I mean, is it just kind of making something that's pretty good a little bit better? And our example there is Apple Pay, which is arguably a somewhat a slight improvement over regular credit cards, but it's not that big an improvement, and it required people to make investments, and so it really hasn't taken off. So are you solving an important problem? Then the second is, how are you going to get off the ground? How are you going to ignite? How are you going to attract critical mass of the two sides that you need? I mean, one of the problems Apple Pay had, still has to some extent, is merchants need a special terminal to use Apple Pay, to accept the contactless payment from the phone, and that required an investment. Well, it's not worth making the investment unless a lot of people want to use that system. And if merchants don't make the investment, then people don't want to use the system because it's not very valuable. So Apple has had a critical mass and an ignition problem. They may solve it. They have enough money. Merchants are installing fancy terminals for other reasons. It may yet go. But they didn't really have a good ignition strategy. And the third thing to think about, is true of all businesses, is why is your solution better than the guy in the garage next door will think of? What sort of keeps you ahead of competition that will emerge? If you're successful, or if other people have the same idea, there will be competition. So you need to ask yourself, do I have intellectual property protection? Do I have a head start? What have I got that, if I can get off the ground, will keep me ahead of the competition? Those really are the three basics that you need to have good answers to for yourself, for any investors. Other issues arise, like in any other business. You're going to have people issues and marketing channel issues and so forth. But for a multi-sided business, I think is it a big problem you're solving? And can you get off the ground? Most of these attempts don't get off the ground. They can't ignite.
Why entrepreneurs have that block at those things? I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of startups and .com companies come and they focus on raising money, which is relatively easy if you are in the certain part of the country near Boston or in the Silicon Valley area, because there is plenty of money to go around. And yet sometimes I guess we keep repeating the same mistakes.
Of course. If you look at the track record for entrepreneurs in any business, you have to be over-optimistic to be an entrepreneur. It's almost a requirement that you're an optimist. If you're a pessimist and you can see how things will fail, then you don't ever try. So you need to be an optimist, and most startups fail. And most venture capital investments fail. But if you make it big, and it's like a lottery. It's the big prize that draws the entries.
If we draw upon one of the examples of most successful e-commerce companies in the last 15 years, obviously is the Amazon. And the name comes up very quickly. We started out as a single-sided business, and then it eventually became a multi-sided business. But what fascinates me is that while Amazon was still a single-sided business, Walmart was very successful and is very successful, and Walmart essentially destroyed Kmart. And how could Walmart miss what Amazon was doing? And Walmart is still lagging, even though it's a distant two in the e-commerce business now and for the consumer retailers. But still, it is not in many ways not a successful multi-sided business.
Well, it never, first of all, Amazon was a technology company at birth, so to speak, and Walmart was a conventional retailer. Now, Walmart had used more technology than people give it credit for, because it has always run a very sophisticated
supply chain,
logistics system and purchasing system and supply chain. Absolutely. But that's a different set of issues. And Amazon was an online vendor at the start and thought hard about technology. I was at Amazon headquarters years ago when I was dean, and we had an MIT alumni meeting, And there were even then a lot of very smart MIT people working for Amazon and smart people from other parts of the country. But the difference is that while Walmart.com is a successful online retailer, what Amazon has done, and a lot of people don't realize this, and the numbers have slipped my mind now, but a very significant proportion of Amazon's revenue and Amazon's profits are, as you mentioned, operating as a multi-sided platform. Amazon Marketplace lets a seller basically use Amazon's platform to reach buyers. So I will often buy something on Amazon that I know is sold directly by the vendor. I just bought, of all things, a water filter, and I looked at the vendor's website and checked out the models and went to Amazon, and Amazon had a better price, and I bought it from Amazon. And what Amazon isn't stocking that. Amazon is just connecting me to the retailer who is then going to ship it to me. So Amazon saw the potential of basically being an online shopping mall. And I don't think Walmart has gone to that model. I don't follow them that closely, but I think Walmart, Walmart.com is still a single-sided business. It still sells Walmart inventory acquired through Walmart's supply chain and delivered probably by UPS, whereas Amazon is linking merchants with consumers like a mall does, but with enormous power. The big advantage of the Amazon mall is you can buy anything. I mean, the range of suppliers that now sell through Amazon means that for any obscure product you can think of, there will be 5 people selling it. When we became grandparents, just a brief story, I'd heard about something called a brag book, which I'd never heard about before, but it's something that grandmothers use to carry pictures of their grandchildren around to show to their friends. This is a product category. So I thought, I'll buy one for my wife. I'd never heard of it before. I'd never seen it before. I went to Amazon. I searched for brag book, and there were about 200 different ones. That's just amazing. And that's powerful.
It is. And as you repeatedly highlight in the book, is that many of these multi-sided platforms are not selling a product or a service, but they are selling access.
Yeah, precisely. They're selling access. What Amazon sells, why would I as a retailer list with Amazon and pay Amazon a fee? Because Amazon connects me to this whole wide world of customers. People talk about Google as the dominant search engine, but more product searches are done on Amazon than on Google. I mean, if I want to buy something, I want to buy a toothbrush, I guess I could Google toothbrush. But if I go to Amazon and say toothbrush, I get a whole list of alternatives with prices that I can easily buy and get delivered to me in 3 days. So for products, Amazon now leads in terms of searches. Truly amazing.
Yeah, as it used to be that people would go to Google to search everything, and then it became just the content, and the product search moved to Amazon, and people search moved to Facebook, and professional networking moved to LinkedIn, and internet eventually got segmented in the last 15 years through these separate niches.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there are even more. There are dating sites that are specialized dating sites for Jewish people, dating sites for various other groups. There are job matching sites, some of which are specialized, some of which, like Monster, are general. So there are all sorts of, and by the way, something like Monster.com is just a perfect example of a matchmaker, right? That's what they do. They connect people who want to hire with people who want jobs. And it's classic. And there will be more as people have great ideas for new products and new ways to link people. And there will be competition, right? I mean, Facebook took over from MySpace. There's an example which my co-author knows well, but I know only from him. Facebook entered India and basically wiped out what had been a dominant local social network. How, why, I don't know, but certainly these market positions aren't fixed forever because, as people used to say, competition is only a click away.
Yeah, they're far more vulnerable. And you bring out a very important issue in the book that most of us don't really appreciate well, and that is the friction. Can you give us a little bit more nuanced view of what that friction is and how important it is to make sure that that friction is as little as possible?
Well, friction is our term for what economists call a transaction cost. It's the cost of basically connecting and executing a transaction of one kind or another. It could be a financial transaction, like buying something. It could be a social transaction, like meeting an attractive person of the opposite sex. There are all kinds of transactions, but they generally involve time, hassle, money to execute. The example we lead with is the reservation service, Open Table, and the friction is calling to get a reservation for Saturday night at 7:00 in a nice restaurant. You could spend an hour on the telephone in a big city, just calling. No, we're full. No, we don't have a table. No, and not only is it a cost for you, but it's a cost for the restaurant. They have to take a lot of calls and tell people, no, sorry, we're full. And Open Table had the right idea that you can reduce that friction by basically displaying an inventory of available tables. The restaurant doesn't have to answer the phone, so it saves labor cost, and you don't have to spend a lot of calls. So getting that transaction done, getting that reservation made when you have a lot of restaurants using the service takes literally minutes, even on a busy day. And I'll tell you the difference. We are at our second home in Vermont at the moment, and restaurants around here tend not to use Open Table. So I spend some time on the phone making restaurant reservations. In Boston, it's a click. So it really all depends. But that's the perfect example, which I know since it was rather hard to make a reservation for Christmas Eve. The online service can reduce that. The other example that we stress in the book is Alibaba in China. When China began to open up to private business, it was difficult to connect buyers and sellers. Business-to-business transactions were difficult because communication wasn't great, transportation wasn't great, but the rule of law wasn't great either. So how would you know that the buyer will pay? How would you know that the supplier would supply? Alibaba did a very good job of putting in place mechanisms to produce trust. Right? You made the payment. The payment wasn't sent until the delivery was received. You made the payment through Alibaba. The payment wasn't sent until you certified that you'd gotten the goods and they were what you wanted. They'd make the payment. You wouldn't send the goods until Alibaba said they have the goods, or rather they have the payment in hand. So all of a sudden, that friction, I don't know these people. How do I know they'll ship? How do I know they'll pay? That friction, that transaction cost was reduced, if not eliminated. That solved a big problem. In the U.S., there were a lot of business-to-business exchanges open, but they didn't really solve any problems. And what they did was they increased competition among sellers, right? If we're all selling nuts and bolts and we're all listed on this exchange, you can compare our prices in a click. That's not a good idea for a seller. And we have telephones and we have transportation and we have courts. So we just don't have the same friction, the same transaction cost that was present in China when China first began to open up. So there are a lot of different frictions, and the clever inventor or innovator in the multi-sided platform arena is going to be somebody who identifies the friction and reduces it. I mean, Uber was a clever idea. Gosh, there are a lot of people who don't want to be permanent cab drivers, who are willing to drive from time to time, and we can use the internet to connect people with drivers in ways that calling for a taxi doesn't quite match. Taxi companies in Boston now have online platforms that you can use to call a taxi, but they can't match the flexibility. So, clever ideas, finding frictions, finding obstacles to people getting together is a way to prosperity. And it's also good for society.
If you draw upon and kind of compare from your perspective, how starting an American Express or more so Visa or MasterCard is different from starting PayPal, because in one model, the one side of the equation depends on the other side of the equation, whereas in the other model, it may or may not depend.
They're all two-sided in some ways. I mean, Visa started with a single bank, and American Express started with a consortium of banks, and MasterCard started with a consortium of banks, and American Express built off earlier businesses to start its payment card. PayPal, I don't know its early history well, but I'm not sure I understand the contrast. PayPal had this problem. It set up initially with the auction site, which I'm now blanking on, but it had a problem of getting merchants to accept it widely and getting people to use it. It's had the same problem.
Yeah, I think I did not probably frame it properly. Maybe what I'm saying is sometimes in the multi-sided businesses, it is very hard and important to balance the both side of the equation, and sometimes you have to do a zigzag effect, as you call it.
Yep.
And it is so important that you do a balanced transition or evolution in order to build what I call, which obviously everybody calls, is the critical scale that you need to succeed.
Yeah, and they all went about it in different ways, right? I mean, Diners Club, which is the first payment card, got the critical mass by mailing cards to lots of wealthy people in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and then went around to restaurants saying, look, our cards are in the hands of all these wealthy people. Don't you think you ought to take them? And put a little sticker in your window saying you take them. Well, it's now illegal to mail cards without solicitation. That's a classic zigzag. You went to one side, then you went to the other side. And there are a variety of examples of alternative strategies. I mean, YouTube was a fascinating launch story. They had this platform, they had it up, and they couldn't get any content up there that anybody wanted to watch. So go to YouTube to see pretty girls. Well, that wasn't enough to draw. Then they had one with a guy in a zoo, and that turned out to work. And then they did all they could think of to get content up, and it finally worked. And then they succeeded explosively. But they were not the only people trying to do that. Just as OpenTable wasn't the only company trying to do a restaurant reservation service, they were just the ones that succeeded.
I think when we expand the universe a little bit to international markets, China, and also you have a very good example of M-Pesa in Kenya. And recently, I think after the book, it just happened this year, is the launch of a cell phone company in India, Reliance Jio.
Yeah, they have a mobile pay as well. I didn't. There are mobile payment systems in a variety of countries, but yeah.
Yeah, but if you can kind of explain a little bit why that M-Pesa was so successful and I think, as you say, there are two things they did right, at least. And one is they solved a problem. And second, they provided the least or the smallest amount of friction cost.
Well, the problem in Kenya, as in a number of developing countries, but particularly in Kenya, was that very often, say, the young man or the man of the house will move to the city to work, and his wife and children will stay home in the village. So how do you send money from the city to the village? Moving cash through the countryside is tough. There aren't banks in little villages, aren't bank branches. Kenya, at the time this system launched, didn't have fancy telephones. People just had plain old flip phones with feature phones, not sophisticated. Kenya had a dominant telecommunications carrier, and they sat down and thought about how they would do this, and they decided to use convenience stores. If you travel around rural Africa, there are all these little stores They're in the cities too, but they're also in rural areas where people can go buy coffee, beans, rice, whatever, lottery tickets, all sorts of things, but small stores. So the idea was you could use the small stores, in effect, as bank branches. The trick was you had to sign up these stores, and then you could say to people, in effect, you can transfer money through these stores. The store owner gets a piece, the sender pays something. You don't sign up too many stores, because if you sign up too many stores, none of them will find it profitable. So you have to grow the set of stores as you grow the volume, which was brilliant. And you have to make it a simple system. So that basically, and then, the telephone begins to sort of look like a mobile banking tool, and you could build a business out from there. It worked in Kenya because they had a single dominant carrier. In a number of other countries where you have multiple incompatible systems, it hasn't worked as well. It's worked in Tanzania. I was in Tanzania, and I saw many carriers advertising mobile services. And I said, mobile banking. I said, how can this work? And the answer is the bank in Kenya required them to talk to each other. They said, you guys can do this, but it has to be possible. They have to interconnect. In a way, that's the best of all worlds, but I don't think it's happened in many countries because banks don't like the competition. But in Kenya, it worked. You had a single carrier that could make national plans. You had a bank regulator that let them do it, and then you had a really clever design and a really clever launch strategy. Getting the pricing right. We go into a lot of detail, not all of which I can remember now in the book, but the cleverness of using a relatively simple technology and a relatively simple design and thinking through the launch. You needed to have enough people using the system to make it profitable for store owners to service them, to spend the time to learn how to do it and spend the hassle. They signed up store owners, but they did a lot of advertising. They had really clever ads to sign up users, and they gave bonuses to you if you sign up and your cousin signs up, there's a bonus. So they worked really hard on the user side. And then once you have users that want to send money, it's not that hard to persuade stores as long as the volume per store is high enough that it pays the store owner to service the system. So they did, I would say, a brilliant job. It's interesting. It hasn't been as widely successful in Africa as you would have thought, but it's not hard to see why. There are regulatory issues and commercial problems, but the design was brilliant, and the design could be used and has been used successfully in a number of other countries, but not as many as you would have thought.
Yeah, I wish people at Western Union and MoneyGram would read the book and understand what they're up against.
Yeah. Well, I think person-to-person money transfers, there are a number of companies that offer that, and I don't know how big a market it is, but it's not a hard thing to do anymore.
Roughly $400 billion are transferred every year.
Yeah.
On a person-to-person basis, legally.
Legally, yeah. And the international transfers pose their own issues.
Yes.
And, I've seen a number of companies that have worked hard to try to make that easy. And it's not easy to make that easy because there are properly all kinds of rules that's set up by governments. But, it is a coming thing. It will, Bitcoin does that for you in a variety of ways.
In the interest of time, if I'm a single-sided supplier, or in the business of single-sided platform, rather, or I'm just running a classic business model, what should I do, or what should I think of doing before I look, or should I be looking at multi-sided platform as a next evolution for my business?
Well, you can look at it, but I think we discussed this issue, not as much maybe as we might. It's just not right. It's a natural step in evolution for every business. We wrote an earlier book on multi-sided platforms called Catalyst Code, And we had an editor that didn't quite understand what we were doing, and as a result, the book just didn't do well. But I remember her asking us, if I were a refrigerator manufacturer, how would I use this book? And the answer is you wouldn't. This is not for you. If you were, I mean, you might think you could go from manufacturing refrigerators to being an online refrigerator platform, but you really have to think, how would that work? What problem would that solve? What are the advantages? I mean, when Amazon went from a single-sided to a multi-sided business, in a way, having been a successful single-sided business, they had a user base. They had a consumer base. They had people who were used to going to Amazon to buy things. That handled the launch strategy, right? That made it possible for them to go to merchants and say, look, we're visited by 10 million people every day. Would you like to have your stuff available? You know, that's pretty attractive, depending on the price and everything else. That's a pretty attractive pitch. But, you know, if I'm making refrigerators, it's not obvious that I want to go online. Maybe I want to sell through Amazon. Maybe that's the best way to take advantage of the internet. Maybe I want to launch my own website. Do I want to sell other people's things on my website? Well, you know, there are costs and benefits. I mean, an interesting example in this regard is Zappos. Zappos had this great idea that they would be an online shoe supermarket, not a supermarket, online shoe mall. So lots of shoe companies could sell through Zappos. You'd go to Zappos, you'd see, like Amazon Marketplace, you'd see all kinds of shoes advertised from different companies, and you would buy them and deal with the company. They found, however, that different companies had different policies for returns, different policies for dealing with customers, and so the Zappos brand became associated with a very uneven experience. They backed off. They became a single-sided business. You're not dealing with shoe company X when you buy through Zappos. You're dealing with Zappos, and you return to Zappos. And Zappos handles the customer relationship itself. It's not just connecting two sides. Now, it is connecting two sides in that Zappos sells a lot of different shoe companies' wares, but they are very importantly single-sided in how they treat customers. So I think the question of, is there an advantage to going to being multi-sided? Well, how would you do it? What would it add? And what are the risks and costs? In Zappos' case, the risk was they couldn't really ensure a good consumer experience. So they backed off and they became single-sided again. So you know, it is a choice. It's not, oh my gosh, the technology lets us do this. It's for what purpose? What does it bring? It could be extraordinary, but you know, you got to say, what's the friction I'm solving? How do I get off the ground? And in the case of an ordinary business, how does doing that build on what I do now? Where does that get me? What does that add? Because it's not a trivial step.
Yes, exactly. It needs certain cash flow to support it first, and then you have to shoot off, and then you have to have a goal. And more important, does it really solve any problem? We have been speaking with Richard Schmalensee. Very exciting to hear about the book, and I'm sure the last chapter is not written in this evolution. It's going to continue for many decades to come.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.